The river swallowed Sergeant, First Class Adiz Okonkwo whole. 47 degrees. Current speed 8 knots and climbing. The extraction helicopter was a memory now, turned back by winds that could shred rotors like paper. 3 miles downstream, 12 hostages waited in a compound that coalition forces had written off 6 hours ago. Command said the mission was over. They said the monsoon made insertion impossible. What Command did not know was that Adiz Okonkwo had grown up swimming the Niger River during the worst storms her village had ever seen, and she had never once let the water win. But that was 4 hours from now. Before we get into what happened next, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Maybe you know someone who has faced impossible odds like what Adiz is about to face. 4 hours earlier, Forward Operating Base Tempest sat beneath a sky the color of wet concrete. Rain hammered the tin roofs of the Tactical Operations Center with a sound like continuous gunfire. Inside, 12 soldiers gathered around a table covered with satellite imagery and topographical maps that were already outdated by the rising floodwaters. Captain Vance Hargrove stood at the head of the table, his weathered face carved into its permanent expression of tactical calculation. 18 years in Special Forces had given him the kind of authority that did not require volume. When he spoke, the room listened. "We have 12 hostages," he said. 8 coalition contractors and 4 local aid workers. The militant group holding them has issued a 24-hour ultimatum. That deadline expires at 0600 tomorrow. After that, they start executions, 1 per hour until their demands are met. Adiz studied the reconnaissance photographs from her position near the back of the room. She was the only woman on Operational Detachment Alpha 7215, a fact that certain members of the team never let her forget. Not through words necessarily, through glances, through the half-second delay before they acknowledged her input, through the way Captain Hargrove's eyes seemed to skip over her when he scanned the room. She had learned to make herself heard anyway. "The compound sits on the riverbank," Hargrove continued. Primary insertion was supposed to be helicopter fast rope onto the roof. But this storm has grounded everything with rotors. Secondary plan was vehicle approach from the North Road, but flooding has made that impassable. We're looking at a mission that cannot be executed. Adiz looked at the map again. Her eyes traced the river from their current position to the compound 3 miles downstream. The current was brutal. She could see that from the satellite imagery, debris scattered across the surface like scatter bones. But she also saw something else. She saw a path. Before she could speak, a voice cut through from near the door. "What about the interpreter?" someone asked. "She's still coming with us if we figure out insertion." Adiz turned to see Staff Sergeant Derek Mulgrew, the team communications specialist everyone called Moose, gesturing toward the corner of the room. There sat Lean, the local interpreter assigned to their team. 22 years old, barely 100 pounds, and trying desperately to disappear into the wall behind her. "If we go," Hargrove said, his tone making clear how unlikely that was. "She goes. We need local language capability." Jean-Luc terrified. Adiz recognized the expression. It was the same one she had seen on her younger sister Kayamika's face the last time she had seen her alive. She pushed that memory down. Not now. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes. Hargrove outlined contingencies that everyone knew were impossible. The team asked questions that had no good answers. And through it all, Adiz kept looking at that river on the map, calculating current speed, water temperature, distance. When Hargrove finally dismissed them, Adiz made her way toward Lean while the others filed out. The young interpreter was still pressed against the wall, clutching a notebook to her chest like a shield. "When did you last eat?" Adiz asked. Lean blinked. "I am sorry. Food. When did you last have food?" Lean's hesitation was answer enough. Adiz reached into her cargo pocket and pulled out her last protein bar. She pressed it into the interpreter's hands. "Eat. You're no good to anyone if you collapse." Moose paused at the door, watching the exchange. He allowed a short laugh. "Careful, Okonkwo. Keep feeding the strays, and they will follow you home." Adiz turned to face him. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes made Moose's smile falter. "She is not a stray," Adiz said. She is the reason any of us will be able to communicate with the hostages once we extract them. She is mission critical, which means making sure she can function is mission critical. That clear enough for you, Staff Sergeant? Moose held her gaze for a moment, then looked away. Yeah, clear. He left without another word. Lean stared at Adiz with something that looked dangerously close to worship. Adiz shook her head. Eat the bar. Get some rest. This is not over yet. She said it with more confidence than she felt, because as she walked toward Captain Hargrove's quarters to propose the only insertion plan that might actually work, she knew exactly how this conversation was going to go. She knocked twice on the doorframe. Hargrove looked up from his tactical tablet, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face. Recognition. Memory. Something that looked almost like pain. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual stone mask. Sergeant Okonkwo, he said. Something you need. Adiz stepped inside. The river, she said. I can swim it. Hargrove stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was not a kind sound. Swim 3 miles of flood stage current in 40-degree water carrying full combat load. He shook his head. That is not a plan. That is a suicide note. I grew up on the Niger River, Adiz said. Monsoon season every year. I was swimming currents like this before I was 10 years old. I completed combat diver qualification with the highest scores in the course's history. I can make this swim. And then what? You arrive at the compound alone, hypothermic, against an unknown number of hostiles. I arrive at the compound with surprise on my side. I conduct reconnaissance, identify entry points, and either execute solo extraction or relay intelligence for a secondary assault once the weather clears. Hargrove set down his tablet. He stood slowly, unfolding his 6'2" frame until he towered over her. Your father, he said quietly, was the finest special forces operator I ever served with. Emeka Okonkwo was a legend, and I watched him die because he took a risk no one else would take. Adiz felt something cold move through her chest. I am not here because of my father. No, Hargrove said. You are here because someone in Washington decided this team needed better optics. You are here because your last name opens doors. But that does not mean you are ready for what waits on the other side of those doors. The words hit like bullets, but Adiz did not flinch. 12 people are going to die tomorrow, she said. I am offering a way to save them, and I am telling you the mission is aborted. Hargrove turned back to his tablet. Dismissed, Sergeant. Adiz stood there for a moment longer, watching the back of his head. Then she turned and walked out into the rain. The water hit her face like a slap. She tilted her head back and let it wash over her, cold and relentless. In her pocket, the waterlogged photograph of Kayamika pressed against her thigh. She had not been able to save her sister. The current had been too strong, and Adiz had been too young, too weak, too slow. But she was not 12 years old anymore. 12 hostages. 24 hours. One impossible swim. Adiz walked toward her quarters to gather her gear. The mission was not aborted. Not for her. Not anymore. Adiz did not go to her quarters. Not yet. Instead, she stood in the rain between buildings, letting the water soak through her uniform while she stared at nothing. Hargrove's words echoed in her skull like rounds in an empty chamber. Someone in Washington decided this team needed better optics. Your last name opens doors. She had heard variations of this before. Every step of her career, someone had been waiting to remind her that she did not truly belong, that her achievements were asterisks, that her presence was a checkbox on some diversity report rather than the result of years of sacrifice and training and pain. But hearing it from Hargrove cut differently, because Hargrove had known her father, had served beside him, had watched him die. The rain intensified. Adiz finally moved, walking not toward her quarters, but toward the eastern perimeter of the base, where a small observation platform overlooked the swollen river. She needed to see it, needed to understand what she was considering. The Mekara River had transformed from a navigable waterway into something monstrous. Brown water churned with debris, entire trees spinning in the current like toys. The sound was a constant roar, drowning out even the hammering rain. Most people would look at that river and see death. Adiz looked at it and saw the Niger during monsoon season. She saw her childhood. She saw every swim that had prepared her for this moment without her knowing it. She reached into her cargo pocket and pulled out the photograph. The lamination had long since failed, and the image was water-damaged, faded, barely recognizable. But Adiz did not need to see it clearly. She had memorized every detail years ago. Kayamika had been 9 years old in the photograph. Adiz had been 11. They stood on the banks of the Niger River, arms around each other, grinning at the camera their mother held. It was the last photograph taken of them together. 3 months later, the monsoon came early and strong, and the river rose faster than anyone expected. Adiz closed her eyes and let the memory come. She usually fought it, pushed it down, buried it beneath training and missions and the constant forward motion of her career. But tonight she let it surface. She remembered the sound first. Kayamika screaming her name. The words torn apart by wind and water until they were just sounds, just terror given voice. Adiz had been on the bank, helping their mother secure the fishing nets, when she saw her sister in the water. Kayamika had gone to retrieve a bucket that was floating away. A simple task, a childish decision, and then the current had her. Adiz ran. She did not think, did not calculate, did not do any of the things that her later training would teach her. She just ran and dove and swam with everything her 12-year-old body could give. The water was cold and violent, and it fought her with something that felt like intention. She could see Kayamika ahead of her, could see her sister's arms reaching, her face appearing and disappearing beneath the brown surface. She swam harder. Her lungs burned. Her muscles screamed. And still the distance between them grew. The last thing she saw was Kayamika's hand, reaching up from the water one final time before the current pulled her under and did not let go. Adiz opened her eyes. The rain had plastered her uniform to her skin, and she was shivering, though not entirely from cold. The photograph was still in her hand, Kayamika's faded smile looking up at her from across 22 years. "I cannot save you," Adiz whispered. "I was not strong enough. I was not fast enough. I was not enough." The words disappeared into the sound of the river. And for a moment, Adiz let herself feel the full weight of that failure. The guilt she had carried since childhood, the driving force behind every swimming record she had broken, every impossible physical challenge she had conquered. She had spent 2 decades trying to become the person who could have saved her sister. And she had succeeded. She was that person now. 12 people were going to die tomorrow if no one acted. 12 families were going to receive notifications. 12 futures were going to end in a warehouse 3 miles downstream. Adiz tucked the photograph back into her pocket. Her hand was steady now. Her breathing had slowed. The decision that had been forming since she first looked at that map in the briefing room finally solidified into certainty. She would make the swim. She would do it alone, without authorization, without support. If she succeeded, command would either court-martial her or give her a medal. If she failed, she would be dead, and it would not matter what anyone thought. Either way, she would not stand by and let 12 people die while she did nothing. Adiz turned from the river and walked toward her quarters with purpose now. She needed her wetsuit, her tactical vest, her rifle, and 4 magazines. She needed waterproof bags for her equipment. She needed to write a note explaining what she was doing in case she did not come back. She was so focused on her mental checklist that she almost walked directly into Sergeant First Class Tomas Restrepo. The team medic stepped back, hands raised in a gesture of surprised apology. "Okonkwo, did not see you there." He paused, studying her face in the dim light. "You are soaked. Have you been standing in the rain this whole time?" Adiz did not answer. Something in her expression must have communicated more than words, because Restrepo's casual demeanor shifted. The medic had served 3 combat deployments, and he had learned to read people the way others read maps. He knew when something significant was happening. "Whatever you are thinking," he said quietly, "be careful." Adiz met his eyes. Restrepo was Colombian-American. He understood what it meant to constantly prove yourself, to fight for respect that others received automatically. He had never treated her as less than. He had never questioned her presence on the team. 12 people, she said. 24 hours. Restrepo nodded slowly. He did not ask for clarification. He did not try to stop her. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small waterproof container. Emergency medical kit, he said. Coagulant, Zutulas, morphine auto-injector. Just in case. Adiz took the kit. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Restrepo stepped aside, clearing her path. Good luck, Okonkwo. Whatever you are about to do. She walked past him without another word. In her quarters, she moved with efficient precision, gathering her gear and sealing it into waterproof bags. She checked her rifle twice, confirmed her magazines were loaded, and verified that every piece of equipment was secured. Then she sat at the small desk and wrote a single page explaining her plan, her reasoning, and her acceptance of full responsibility. The note ended with 2 sentences. Do not search for me if I fail. Focus on hostages. She left the note on her bunk, where someone would find it by morning. At 1400 hours, Sergeant First Class Adiz Okonkwo slipped out of forward operating base Tempest through a gap in the eastern perimeter. The rain had not stopped. The river had not calmed. Nothing about the situation had changed except her. She reached the bank and stood at the edge of the churning water. The current looked even more violent from this close, a living thing hungry for anything foolish enough to enter its domain. The water temperature would be 47 degrees. The swim would be 3 miles. The odds of survival were not something she wanted to calculate. Adiz pulled her rifle tight against her back, adjusted the waterproof bags containing her equipment, and thought of Kayamika one last time. I could not save you, she said to the ghost of her sister, but I can save them. Then she walked into the river, and the current took her. The cold hit her like a physical blow. 47 degrees translated from a number on a briefing report into a full-body assault that drove the air from her lungs and sent her nervous system into immediate panic. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to claw her way to the bank, to escape the freezing grip of the Mekara River before it killed her. Adiz ignored her instincts. She had trained for this. She had lived for this. The current seized her with terrifying strength, spinning her sideways and pulling her downstream faster than she had anticipated. The briefing had said 8 knots. This was closer to 10, maybe 11. The monsoon had intensified since the satellite data was collected, and the river had responded by becoming something far more dangerous than anyone had predicted. She fought for orientation, kicking hard to bring her body parallel to the current rather than perpendicular. Basic river survival. You could not fight the water directly. You had to work with it, guide it, convince it to take you where you needed to go. Her rifle was strapped across her back, muzzle up, wrapped in waterproof covering. She could feel its weight shifting with every movement, threatening to unbalance her. The equipment bags were secured to her tactical vest, adding drag that the current exploited at every opportunity. She was carrying 30 pounds of gear and water that wanted to strip her naked and leave her bones on the riverbed. The Niger River had been her first teacher. Growing up in the village outside Lagos, Adiz had learned to swim before she could properly run. Her father, before he left for America and the military career that would eventually kill him, had taken her to the river every morning. He had taught her to read currents like others read books. He had shown her how to find the calm spaces between chaos, the eddies and back currents that could give a swimmer rest. Most importantly, he had taught her that the river was not an enemy. It was a negotiation. Adiz stopped fighting the current's lateral pull and instead focused on maintaining her position in the flow. She needed to stay in the center of the river where the water was deepest and the debris was less likely to accumulate. The banks were death traps, lined with submerged trees and wreckage that could pin a swimmer and hold them under until their lungs filled. She settled into a rhythm. Stroke, stroke, breathe. Stroke, stroke, breathe. Her arms cut through the brown water with mechanical precision, each movement conserving energy while maintaining forward progress. The cold was still brutal, but her body was beginning to adapt, the initial shock fading into a persistent ache that she could manage. 1 mile. That was her first goal. Get 1 mile downstream and reassess. The water around her was opaque with sediment, visibility reduced to nothing. She was swimming blind, trusting her training and her instincts to warn her of danger before it killed her. The sound of the river filled her ears, a constant roar that drowned out thought and left only sensation. She almost missed the tree. It came out of the darkness like a lunging predator, a massive trunk spinning in the current with branches splayed like grasping fingers. Adiz saw it a fraction of a second before impact, a darker shape in the dark water, and threw herself sideways with desperate force. The trunk passed so close she felt bark scrape against her leg, branches whipping across her back and nearly tearing the rifle from its straps. Then it was gone, spinning away downstream, and she was still alive. Her heart hammered against her ribs. That had been close. Too close. The river was throwing obstacles at her faster than she could track, and she had only covered a few hundred meters. 3 miles. She had to survive 3 miles of this. Adiz forced her breathing to slow. Panic was the enemy now. Panic would make her sloppy, would drain her energy, would get her killed. She thought of her father's voice, calm and steady during those childhood swimming lessons. The river does not hate you, Adiz. It does not love you. It simply is. Your job is to be what the river cannot defeat. She had not understood those words as a child. She understood them now. The current carried her around a bend, and suddenly the water calmed. She had found an eddy, a pocket of relatively still water created by some underwater obstruction. Adiz took advantage immediately, reducing her stroke rate and letting the calm water support her while she caught her breath. Her arms were already beginning to burn. The cold was leaching strength from her muscles faster than she had anticipated. At this rate, she would be dangerously fatigued before she reached the halfway point. She could not afford to think about that. Focus on the next stroke, then the next, then the next. Break the impossible swim into individual moments, and each moment became survivable. In the brief calm, her mind drifted to the hostages. 12 people who had no idea she was coming. They were probably terrified, watching the hours tick down toward their execution deadline. Some of them might have already given up hope. Some of them might be praying for a rescue that command had officially canceled. Adiz was their answer. A single soldier swimming through impossible conditions because no one else would try. It was insane. It was suicidal. It was exactly the kind of mission her father would have taken. Maybe Hargrove was right. Maybe she was chasing her father's ghost, trying to prove something that could never be proven. But even if that was true, even if her motivations were tangled with grief and guilt and the memory of a sister she could not save, the outcome remained the same. 12 people would live or die based on what she did in the next few hours. That was enough. That had to be enough. The eddy released her, and the current reclaimed its grip. Adiz resumed her rhythm. Stroke, stroke, breathe. Stroke, stroke, breathe, pushing through water that grew colder with every passing minute. The rain continued to fall, dimpling the surface above her whenever she turned her face toward the sky. She marked her progress by the terrain on the banks. Dense jungle gave way to scattered clearings, then back to jungle. She passed the wreckage of a wooden bridge, its supports twisted by the flood. She saw what might have been a drowned animal floating past, but she did not look closely enough to confirm. 1 mile down, 2 to go. The water temperature dropped again, sharp enough that she felt it like a blade across her skin. Somewhere upstream, a cold spring or snowmelt tributary had joined the river. Her muscles contracted involuntarily, and she lost her rhythm for 3 strokes before forcing herself back into pattern. The river was getting worse. The current was accelerating as the channel narrowed between rocky outcroppings she could not see. White water appeared ahead, and she heard the sound of rapids before she saw them. This was not in the briefing. This was not supposed to be here. Adiz had seconds to decide. Fight for the bank and risk the debris, or ride the rapids and risk being dashed against rocks she could not see. She chose the rapids. She chose to trust the current. The water seized her with renewed violence, throwing her forward into chaos. She tucked her chin, protected her rifle, and let the river have its way while she fought only to keep her head above the surface. Then something large moved beside her in the churning darkness. Something that was not debris. Something that seemed to be swimming with purpose. and it was keeping pace with her. The shape in the water brushed against her leg, and Adi's heart stopped. Her mind conjured images of river predators, of teeth and scales, and cold, reptilian hunger. She kicked away instinctively, losing her rhythm, swallowing water that tasted like mud and decay. Then the shape rolled in the current, and she saw what it actually was. A cow. A dead cow, bloated and spinning in the flood, its stiff legs occasionally twitching as the water manipulated its corpse. The animal must have been caught in the rising waters upstream, drowned, and sent downstream as another piece of debris in the river's endless collection. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by disgust at herself. She had nearly panicked over a dead farm animal. The cold was affecting her mind as much as her body, making her slow and stupid and prone to mistakes that could get her killed. She pushed past the carcass and resumed swimming. 2 miles down, 1 remaining. Her muscles burned with lactic acid buildup, and her fingers had gone numb 15 minutes ago. Hypothermia was setting in despite her constant movement. She could feel her core temperature dropping, her body beginning the slow process of shutting down non-essential functions to preserve her vital organs. 3 miles downstream, in the compound that Adiz was fighting to reach, 12 hostages huddled in darkness and terror. The warehouse stank of fear and human waste. The militants had provided 1 bucket for 12 people, and that bucket had overflowed 2 days ago. Elena Vasquez, an aid worker from a medical charity, sat with her back against the wall and her arms wrapped around her pregnant belly. The contractions had started 6 hours ago. They were getting closer together. Around her, the other hostages existed in various states of despair. The coalition contractors had stopped talking about rescue yesterday. The local aid workers prayed quietly in languages the others did not understand. Everyone had heard the deadline. Everyone knew what came at 0600. A militant entered the warehouse, his rifle sweeping across the hostages with casual menace. His name was not important. What mattered was the radio clipped to his vest and the conversation he had been having for the past hour. "They are not coming," he announced to the room in accented English. "Your people have abandoned you. The storm has made them cowards." Elena felt another contraction tighten across her belly. The baby was coming whether rescue arrived or not. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what hope felt like. Miles upstream, Adiz knew nothing of Elena's contractions or the militants' radio communications. She knew only the water and the cold and the burning need to keep moving forward. Her father's voice came to her unbidden, rising from memory like a lifeline thrown across decades. She was 10 years old again, struggling against a current that wanted to push her toward the riverbank. Her father swam beside her, his powerful strokes making the water look easy. "Do not fight the river directly, Adiz. You will lose. Find the current within the current. There is always a path." She had not understood then. She understood now. Adiz stopped fighting the main flow and instead searched for the subtle variations within it. There, a slightly slower channel on the left side, where underwater geography created resistance against the primary current. She adjusted her angle and felt the immediate difference. The water still pushed, but it pushed less hard. She was working with the river now instead of against it. Her father had died 7 years ago on a mission in a country that officially did not have American soldiers. Adiz had been at Fort Bragg when the notification team arrived. They told her that Master Sergeant Emeka Okonkwo had died heroically, that his actions had saved lives, that he was a credit to the Special Forces community. They did not tell her that Captain Vance Hargrove had been on that mission. They did not tell her that Hargrove had watched her father die and carried that weight ever since. She had learned those details later, pieced together from after-action reports and conversations with soldiers who had been there. Hargrove blamed himself. That was why he pushed Adiz away. Every time he looked at her, he saw Emeka Okonkwo's face and remembered the moment he could not save him. The river narrowed ahead, and Adiz saw the bridge too late. It had been a vehicle crossing once, wooden planks over steel supports, strong enough to handle military trucks. The flood had destroyed it completely, leaving only a tangle of twisted metal and shattered timber that spanned the entire width of the river. Debris had accumulated against the wreckage, creating a dam of destruction that the current was determined to push her through. There was no time to avoid it, no time to reach the bank, no time to do anything except take the deepest breath her cold lungs could manage and dive. She went under just before impact, kicking for depth, trying to pass beneath the worst of the obstruction. The water was black and violent and absolutely silent. Metal scraped against her tactical vest. Wood slammed against her shoulder. Something caught her rifle strap and yanked her backward with force that nearly dislocated her arm. Adiz twisted, fighting to free herself. Her lungs were already burning. She had maybe 30 seconds of air remaining, and she was pinned against underwater wreckage by a current that would not relent. The strap gave way suddenly, and she shot forward through a gap in the debris. She kicked desperately for the surface, her vision beginning to sparkle with oxygen deprivation. 10 seconds. 5. Her head broke the surface, and she gasped, swallowing air and water in equal measure. She coughed, choked, forced herself to keep swimming even as her body tried to curl into a ball of misery. She was through. She was alive. The relief lasted exactly 3 seconds. That was how long it took Adiz to reach for her rifle and find empty straps. Her weapon was gone. She looked back at the bridge wreckage, already 50 meters behind her and receding fast. Somewhere in that tangle of metal and wood, her rifle hung suspended, useless, unreachable. She was 1 mile from a compound full of armed militants. She had 4 magazines of ammunition strapped to her vest for a weapon she no longer possessed. She had Restrepo's emergency medical kit and a knife on her belt, and absolutely nothing else that could help her complete this mission. Adiz let the current carry her forward while she processed the enormity of what had just happened. 12 hostages, unknown number of enemies, 0600 deadline, and she was completely unarmed. For the first time since entering the water, Adiz stopped swimming. The current carried her forward anyway, indifferent to her despair, but she let her arms float limp at her sides and stared at the dark sky above. Rain continued to fall on her upturned face. The river continued to roar its endless hunger. And somewhere ahead, 12 people continued to wait for a rescue that had just become impossible. What was she supposed to do now? Storm a militant compound with a knife? Throw ammunition at armed men and hope they flinched? The mission had been suicidal when she had a rifle. Without one, it was simply suicide. Maybe that was the point. Maybe she had been swimming toward death this entire time, and the rifle had just been a comfortable illusion that let her pretend otherwise. Her body was failing. She could feel it in the sluggish response of her muscles, the way her thoughts moved like they were wrapped in wet cotton. Hypothermia had progressed beyond discomfort into something more dangerous. Her core temperature had dropped low enough that her body was beginning to sacrifice her extremities to keep her organs functioning. Soon it would sacrifice her mind as well. She could stop fighting. The thought arrived with seductive clarity. She could let the river have her, let the cold finish what the current had started. It would almost be peaceful, just a slow fading into darkness, and then nothing at all. Kayamika had not had that choice. Kayamika had fought until the very last second, her small arms reaching for a sister who was not fast enough to save her. The memory crashed over Adiz with force that had nothing to do with the river. Suddenly, she was 12 years old again, swimming through brown water with lungs that burned and arms that screamed. She could see Kayamika ahead of her, could see the terror in her sister's eyes, could hear her name being called in a voice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Adiz, Adiz, help me. Please help me. She had tried. God knows she had tried. She had pushed her body beyond anything it should have been capable of, had ignored the pain and the cold and the current that fought her at every stroke. But it was not enough. She was not enough. And in the end, all she could do was watch her sister's hand disappear beneath the surface and know that she would carry that image forever. 22 years. She had carried it for 22 years. The river wanted to take her the same way it had taken Kayamika. It wanted to pull her under and hold her down and add her bones to the countless others it had claimed over the centuries. That was what rivers did. That was what currents did. They took and never gave anything back. But Kayamika was not here. Kayamika had been 9 years old, a child caught in forces she could not understand or resist. The people in that compound were not children. They were adults who had been abandoned by the system that was supposed to protect them, and they deserved someone willing to fight for them. Adiz had not been able to save her sister. She had lived with that failure every single day since. But she could save these 12 people. She could honor Kayamika's memory by refusing to let the water win again. She started swimming. Her arms felt like they belonged to someone else, heavy and clumsy and barely responsive. But they moved. They pulled her through the water with strokes that were ugly and inefficient, but still functional. She was not swimming with technique anymore. She was swimming with pure, stubborn refusal to die. 300 meters ahead, something caught her attention. A dark shape pressed against the riverbank, pinned there by an eddy that had formed around a partially submerged boulder. Debris accumulated in such places, creating temporary dams that the flood would eventually destroy. Adiz altered her course, fighting the current to reach the bank. Her fingers scraped against mud and roots as she pulled herself into the eddy's relative calm. The shape was larger now, more defined. It was her rifle. The weapon had floated downstream faster than she had, caught in a surface current while she struggled beneath the bridge wreckage. Some miracle of fluid dynamics had deposited it here, tangled in branches but otherwise intact. Adiz reached for it with hands that shook so badly she could barely grip the stock. The waterproof covering had held. She checked the chamber, verified the magazine, and felt something that might have been hope kindle in her chest for the first time in an hour. She was still in the game. The eddy gave her a moment to rest, and she took it. Her body screamed for warmth, for stillness, for anything other than continued abuse. She gave it 60 seconds. 60 seconds to catch her breath, assess her condition, and prepare for the final push. 1 mile remaining. The compound was close now. She could almost feel it waiting for her downstream. Adiz pushed off from the bank and let the current reclaim her. Her rifle was secured across her back once more, the familiar weight a comfort that went beyond tactical utility. She had her weapon. She had her training. She had one chance to make this work. The river curved ahead, and as she rounded the bend, she saw lights. The village of Kayasan spread across the eastern bank, a collection of structures that should have been dark and empty according to the intelligence briefing. The flood should have driven the residents to higher ground days ago. But the lights were on. Fires burned in barrels along the waterfront. And as Adiz drifted closer, keeping low in the water, she could see figures moving between the buildings. They were not villagers. The silhouettes carried rifles. She counted 8, then 12, then stopped counting because the number kept growing. Militant. The village was a staging area, a forward position for reinforcements heading to the compound or security elements watching the river approach. The intelligence had been wrong, catastrophically wrong. Adiz sank lower in the water until only her eyes remained above the surface. The current was carrying her directly toward the occupied village. In approximately 3 minutes, she would pass close enough for the firelight to reveal her to anyone watching the river. She had 1 mile left to the compound, but between her and the hostages stood an army she had not known existed. Adiz angled toward the far bank, putting maximum distance between herself and the firelight. The western shore was darker, thick jungle pressing right to the water's edge. If she could reach it before passing the village, she might slip by undetected. Her arms moved with mechanical desperation. Every stroke sent pain radiating through muscles that had nothing left to give. The cold had burrowed so deep in her bones that she could no longer feel her feet. But she kept swimming because the alternative was dying in full view of people who would celebrate her failure. 50 meters to the bank. 40. 30. A voice called out from the village. Adiz froze, letting herself sink until the water touched her chin. Had they seen her? Were they already raising weapons? But the shout was not directed at the river. Two militants were arguing near one of the barrel fires, their voices carrying across the water in fragments she could not understand. After a moment, both men laughed and turned away. Adiz reached the bank and pulled herself into the jungle undergrowth. The ground was muddy and cold, but it was not trying to kill her, and right now that counted as an improvement. She lay still for 30 seconds, letting her heart rate slow, listening for any indication that her passage had been noticed. Nothing. The village continued its activity, oblivious to the soldier who had just slipped past their perimeter. She needed to move. The compound was still a mile downstream, and every minute she delayed was a minute closer to the execution deadline. But her body refused to cooperate. Her legs would not support her weight. Her hands shook so violently she could barely grip her rifle. Hypothermia had progressed further than she realized. If she did not find warmth soon, she would be combat ineffective within the hour. A sound behind her. Adiz spun, raising her rifle toward the darkness despite hands that could barely hold it steady. A figure emerged from the jungle, small and hunched, moving with the careful steps of someone who knew these woods intimately. An old woman, 70 at least, maybe older, wearing clothes that had been patched and repatched until the original fabric was barely visible. She stopped 10 feet from Adiz and studied her with eyes that held no fear. "American," the woman said. It was not a question. Adiz kept her rifle raised. "Who are you?" "My name is May, and you need to lower that weapon before you fall over and shoot yourself by accident." Adiz wanted to argue, but the old woman had a point. Her arms were trembling badly enough that maintaining aim was becoming impossible. She lowered the rifle, but kept her finger near the trigger guard. "The men in the village," Adiz said. "You're not with them." May spat on the ground. "Those animals killed my son 3 years ago. They burned my home last month. I am here because I have nowhere else to go, and they do not consider old women worth noticing." She paused, studying Adiz with renewed interest. "You came from the river. You're going to the compound. How do you know about the compound?" "Everyone knows. The foreigners they hold there, the deadline they announced." May stepped closer, lowering her voice even though no one else was near. "You are alone. One soldier against 40 men. That is suicide." Adiz felt something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with the river. 40. The briefing had estimated 15 to 20 militants at the compound. Intelligence was wrong about everything. "I do not have a choice," Adiz said. May stared at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, as if confirming something to herself. "Come with me. You need warmth and food. And information. I can give you all 3. Every instinct screamed at Adiz to refuse. She did not know this woman, could not verify her intentions. For all she knew, May was leading her into a trap, but she also could not complete the mission as a hypothermic wreck barely capable of standing. She needed recovery time. She needed intelligence. And something in the old woman's eyes, some depth of grief and hatred that Adiz recognized from her own reflection, told her that May was sincere. Adiz followed. May led her through the jungle along paths that were invisible to anyone who did not know them. After 5 minutes, they reached a small shelter, barely more than a tarp stretched over branches, hidden in a depression that would be invisible from more than 10 feet away. A small fire burned in a pit lined with stones. The smoke dispersed through a canopy that prevented any visible plume. May gestured for Adiz to sit near the flames. The warmth hit Adiz like a physical blow. She had not realized how close to shut down her body had come until heat began seeping back in her core. Her hands tingled painfully as circulation returned. She bit back a groan and focused on the old woman. May was preparing something in a battered pot. Within minutes, she pressed a cup of hot broth into Adiz's shaking hands. "Drink, then we talk." The broth was thin and tasted like boiled roots, but it was the most delicious thing Adiz had ever consumed. She felt strength returning with each swallow, her body greedily absorbing the warmth and calories. "The compound," Adiz said between sips. "Tell me everything." May settled across the fire from her. Old warehouse on the river. 1 main building, 2 smaller structures. They keep the hostages in the main building. Single entrance, heavy guard. The back wall faces the jungle, fewer eyes watching there. How do you know all this? My grandson works for them. Not by choice. They took him 2 years ago, made him a soldier. But he still finds ways to send me information when he can. May's eyes hardened. He told me about the pregnant woman. She's been in labor since yesterday morning. The baby is coming whether your people rescue them or not. Adi's grip tightened on the cup. Yesterday morning. That meant the woman had been in labor for almost 20 hours in a warehouse with no medical care, surrounded by men who would kill her at dawn. The timeline just became impossible. She could not wait for optimal conditions. She could not spend hours observing and planning. She had to move now. There is something else, May said. Her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Something my grandson told me this morning before the militants stopped his messages. Adiz leaned forward. They have a radio. They communicate with someone at your base. Someone who tells them when operations are planned, when soldiers are coming. May met Adiz's eyes with an intensity that burned through the darkness. Someone at your base told them the rescue mission was canceled. That is why they are celebrating tonight. They think no one is coming. Adiz felt the words hit her like bullets. A traitor. Someone at FOB Tempest was feeding information to the militants. Someone had told them the mission was aborted, and that someone had no idea she was out here. A traitor. The word echoed through Adiz's mind as she processed what May had revealed. Someone at Forward Operating Base Tempest, someone wearing the same uniform she wore, had been feeding intelligence to the people who were going to execute 12 innocent hostages at dawn. She thought of the faces around that briefing table. Hargrove, Moose, Restrepo, the intelligence officers, the communications specialists, the support staff who moved through the base with access to operational details. Any one of them could be the source. Any one of them could have blood on their hands. But that was a problem for later. Right now, she had hostages to rescue and a pregnant woman who had been in labor for 20 hours. I need to move, Adiz said, setting down the empty cup. The warmth had done its work. Her hands had steadied. Her core temperature had climbed back toward functional, and her mind had sharpened from the dull fog of hypothermia into focused clarity. May nodded, but did not move from her position by the fire. Before you go, she said, I must ask you something. What is your family name? Adiz hesitated. The question felt out of place, irrelevant to the mission at hand. Okonkwo, she said finally. My name is Adiz Okonkwo. The change in May's expression was immediate and profound. The old woman's eyes widened, and for a moment she looked like she might weep. Okonkwo, May repeated. Emeka Okonkwo. That was your father. Adiz felt the ground shift beneath her. You knew my father. Knew him. May laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Your father saved this village 15 years ago. A warlord was burning everything in his path, killing anyone who resisted. Your father and his team arrived when we had given up hope. They fought for 3 days to protect us. 27 of your soldiers against 200 enemies. May shook her head slowly. Your father carried my husband to safety after he was wounded. He stayed with him until the helicopters came. He did not have to do that. He was not ordered to do that. He did it because it was right. Adiz had known her father was a hero. She had read the citations, seen the medals, heard the stories from soldiers who served with him. But hearing it from May, from someone whose life he had personally touched, made it real in a way it had never been before. That is why you are helping me, she said. Your father gave us a future. May rose slowly, her old bones protesting the movement. Now his daughter has come to save more lives. I do not believe in coincidences, Sergeant Okonkwo. I believe in purpose. She reached into the shelter and withdrew a folded piece of paper. A map, hand-drawn, showing the compound and the surrounding terrain in surprising detail. My grandson drew this, May said. The back wall is weakest. 2 guards, sometimes 3, but they watch the jungle, not the river. If you approach from the water side along the bank, you can reach the wall without being seen. Adiz studied the map, committing every detail to memory. The main warehouse sat in the center of the compound, flanked by 2 smaller buildings that May identified as living quarters for the militants. A motor pool occupied the northern corner. The southern edge bordered the river, with a dock that was currently underwater due to the flood. The hostages are in the main warehouse, May continued. Main entrance faces east toward the road. There are windows on the north and south walls, but they are boarded up. The only way in is through the door or through the roof. The roof. Adiz looked at the map again. How sturdy is the structure? Old corrugated metal, rusted through in places. A strong person could break through if they knew where to step. Adiz folded the map and tucked it into her vest. This information could mean the difference between success and failure, between 12 people living and 12 people dying. Thank you, she said, for the warmth, the food, everything. May gripped Adiz's arm with surprising strength. Save them, she said. Save them like your father saved us. And when you return to your base, find a snake in your garden. Find them and make them answer for what they have done. Adiz did not make promises she could not keep, but she nodded once, and that was enough. The jungle closed around her as she left May's camp behind. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the sounds of the night pressed in from all directions. Insects chirped in endless chorus. Small animals rustled through the undergrowth. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out in warning. After the roar of the river, the relative quiet felt almost oppressive. Every footstep seemed amplified. Every breath sounded loud enough to betray her position. Adiz moved with the patience her training had instilled, testing each step before committing her weight, pausing at irregular intervals to listen for anything out of place. The final mile took nearly an hour. She smelled the compound before she saw it. Generator exhaust, cooking smoke, and the unmistakable odor of too many people in too small a space. Then the jungle thinned, and through the remaining vegetation, she could see the lights. The warehouse rose against the dark sky like a rusted monument to captivity. Floodlights mounted on poles cast pools of harsh illumination across the muddy ground. Men moved between buildings, their rifles visible even at this distance. Adiz found a concealed position and began her count. 2 guards at the main entrance. 3 more patrolling the perimeter in a loose rotation. 4 visible through the windows of the living quarters. 2 at the motor pool, working on a vehicle despite the hour. And at the back wall, just as May had promised, only 2 sentries watching the jungle with the bored posture of men who expected nothing to happen. 12 guards visible. But May had said 40 militants total, which meant at least 28 more somewhere she could not see, sleeping in the living quarters, inside the warehouse with the hostages, scattered throughout the compound in positions her vantage point did not reveal. Adiz checked her rifle. 1 magazine loaded, 3 more her vest. 120 rounds against an unknown number of enemies. The math was not just unfavorable. It was catastrophic, but the math had never been the point. She thought of Kayamika reaching up from the water one last time. She thought of her father carrying a wounded stranger to safety because it was right. She thought of Elena, laboring in darkness, waiting for a rescue that everyone except one stubborn soldier had abandoned. Adiz rose from her concealment and began moving toward the wall. 1 rifle. For magazines. 0 backup. 12 lives waiting to be saved. The back wall of the compound rose 12 feet above the muddy ground. Adiz pressed herself against a tree at the jungle's edge, 30 meters from the 2 guards May had described. They stood beneath a makeshift awning, sharing a cigarette and speaking in low voices. Their rifles hung loosely from shoulder straps. Their attention was directed toward the tree line, but their posture said they expected nothing. She had spent years training for moments exactly like this. Close quarters infiltration, silent neutralization, the art of moving through space without disturbing it. Adiz waited for the cloud cover to thicken, dimming the ambient light from the compound's floods. When the darkness deepened, she moved. 30 meters became 20. 20 became 10. The guards continued their conversation, oblivious. One of them laughed at something the other said. 5 meters, close enough to smell the cigarette smoke. She came out of the darkness like something that had always been there. Her left hand clamped over the first guard's mouth while her right drove her knife into the base of his skull. He dropped without a sound. The second guard turned at the movement, his eyes widening with shock, but Adiz was already on him. The knife found his throat before he could cry out. 2 bodies. 0 alarms. She dragged them into the shadows beneath the awning and took a moment to assess. The compound spread before her in stark detail. The main warehouse sat 80 meters ahead, its rusted walls illuminated by floodlights that turned the surrounding mud into a glowing stage. 2 guards stood at the main entrance, their attention fixed on the road beyond. More guards patrolled between buildings, their patterns irregular enough to be dangerous. Then she heard the screaming. A woman's voice, raw with pain, cutting through the night from inside the warehouse. The sound was primal, unmistakable. Elena was deep in labor, and something was wrong. The guards at the main entrance exchanged glances. One of them stepped toward the warehouse door, clearly considering whether to investigate. His partner grabbed his arm and shook his head. Their problem, not ours, the second guard said, loud enough for Adiz to hear. The screaming continued, rising and falling in waves. And as it did, Adiz noticed something else. The patrol patterns were disrupted. Guards who should have been circulating through the compound had gathered near the living quarters, their attention drawn by the sounds from the warehouse. 3 militants stood in a cluster near the motor pool, talking and gesturing toward the source of the noise. Elena's labor was creating chaos, and chaos created opportunity. Adiz moved along the back wall, staying in the shadows cast by stacked crates and abandoned equipment. 20 meters to a gap between buildings. 15. 10. A guard appeared around the corner without warning. He was young, barely out of his teens, and he was looking back over his shoulder toward the warehouse as he walked. He never saw Adiz until her knife was already moving. His eyes went wide, then empty, and she caught his body before it could hit the ground. 3 down. She was running out of shadows to hide bodies. The gap between buildings led to a narrow alley that ran parallel to the warehouse's south wall. May's grandson had marked this route on his map. It was the least patrolled approach to the main structure. Adiz pressed forward, her rifle now in her hands, finger alongside the trigger guard. Silent kills were no longer possible. The next engagement would be loud, and once that happened, she would have seconds before the entire compound converged on her position. She reached the corner of the warehouse and paused. The main entrance was 40 meters ahead, still guarded by 2 militants. The south wall stretched before her, windowless except for a single door marked on May's map as a secondary exit. According to the grandson, it was usually barred from the inside. Elena screamed again, and this time the sound was different. Not just pain. There was triumph in it, and something else that took Adiz a moment to recognize. A baby's cry, then silence. The infant had been born, but why had it stopped crying? Adiz reached the secondary door and tested the handle. Locked as expected. She examined the frame, found the weakness where rust had eaten through the metal, and applied pressure. The door groaned but held. She hit it harder, throwing her shoulder into the weakest point. The frame buckled. One more strike, and the door burst inward, spilling Adiz into the warehouse. The smell hit her first. Sweat, fear, human waste, and the copper tang of blood. The warehouse was dimly lit by battery lanterns scattered across the floor. Shapes huddled against the walls, hostages who flinched away from the sudden intrusion. Adiz swept the space with her rifle, counting faces. 1, 2, 3, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 hostages. There should have been 12. In the center of the room, Elena lay on a makeshift bed of blankets and clothing. A baby rested on her chest, motionless, not crying. 2 other hostages knelt beside her, their faces masks of fear and exhaustion. The baby, Adiz said, "Is it alive?" One of the kneeling hostages looked up. A woman, middle-aged, with blood on her hands from assisting the birth. "The baby is not breathing well," she said. "We need help. We need a doctor." Adiz stepped forward, but something made her stop. A prickling at the back of her neck. The instinct that had kept her alive through dozens of combat deployments. The hostages were all looking past her. Not at her. Past her. She spun, rifle rising, but she was too slow. The 12th hostage stood behind the door, she had just broken through. A man, coalition contractor by his clothing, with a pistol leveled at Adi's head. His hands were steady. His eyes were calm. There was no fear in his expression, only cold calculation. "Lower your weapon," he said. Slowly. Adiz did not move. "Who are you?" "My name is Victor Soren. I'm the reason these hostages are still alive. And I am the reason your rescue mission was canceled." The man smiled without warmth. "Did you really think you could swim 3 miles through a flooded river without anyone noticing? I have been watching you since you left the village." The traitor was not at FOB Tempest. The traitor was here, pretending to be a hostage, controlling everything from inside the warehouse. And now he had a gun pointed at her head. Adi's mind raced through calculations even as her body remained frozen. Victor Soren stood 6 feet away, his pistol steady, his finger on the trigger. At this range, she could not dodge a bullet. She could not raise her rifle faster than he could fire. Any aggressive movement would end with her dead on the warehouse floor. But she noticed things, small things. The angle of his stance, weight slightly forward. The tension in his shoulders, tight, but not locked. The way his eyes kept flicking toward the door she had broken through, watching for the militants who would eventually come to investigate. He was confident, but he was not comfortable. He had expected her to die in the river. Her presence here was a complication he had not planned for. "Why?" Adiz asked. Her voice was calm despite the gun aimed at her skull. "The hostages need to hear this. They deserve to know why you sold them out." Victor's smile flickered with something that might have been irritation. "You want a confession? Fine. These people are leverage, nothing more. The company I actually work for has interests in this region that your government keeps interfering with. The hostage situation creates pressure. Pressure creates policy changes. Everyone gets what they want eventually, and I get paid enough to retire somewhere without an extradition treaty. Money. It was always money. Around the warehouse, the hostages watched the confrontation with varying degrees of comprehension. Some are frozen with fear. Others seem to be calculating their own chances of survival. A young man near the back wall had shifted his weight forward, his hands clenching into fists. "Do not try anything heroic," Victor said without looking away from Adiz. "The militants will be here in minutes. Anyone who moves dies before they can help." On a makeshift bed, Elena clutched her silent baby against her chest. The infant had stopped moving. Its skin was taking on a bluish tinge that Adiz recognized with cold horror. The baby was not breathing. In minutes, maybe less, it would be dead. She thought of Restrepo's emergency medical kit, still secured to her vest. She thought of the training she had received in combat first aid, including neonatal resuscitation. She thought of Kayamika, reaching up from the water, waiting to be saved. Not again. She would not watch another innocent die while she stood helpless. "The baby needs help," Adiz said. "Let me help the baby, and I will lower my weapon." Victor's eyes narrowed. "You think I care about the baby? I think you care about your leverage." Adiz kept her voice level. "A dead infant makes the hostage situation politically toxic. International outrage, media attention, pressure on your employers. A living baby keeps things clean. Let me save the child, and you maintain your value." The calculation played across Victor's face. He was weighing variables, assessing outcomes. For a moment, Adiz thought he would refuse. Then he nodded once. Slowly. "Keep your rifle aimed at the floor. Any sudden movements, and I shoot you and the mother both." Adiz lowered her rifle to a 45-degree angle and moved toward Elena. Each step was measured, deliberate, designed to appear non-threatening while closing the distance between herself and Victor. The woman who had assisted the birth moved aside as Adiz knelt beside Elena. Up close, the situation was worse than she had feared. The baby was limp, its lips turning blue, its tiny chest motionless. Adiz pulled Restrepo's medical kit from her vest and opened it with one hand while her other hand gently lifted the infant from Elena's chest. "What are you doing?" Elena whispered. Her voice was raw from screaming. "Saving your child." Adiz cleared the baby's airway with practiced movements, tilting the tiny head back to open the throat. She placed her mouth over the infant's nose and mouth and delivered 2 small breaths, watching the chest rise and fall. Nothing. She checked for a pulse, found one, weak but present. The baby had a heartbeat. It just was not breathing on its own. Adiz delivered 2 more breaths, then 2 more. Behind her, she heard Victor shifting his weight. "Enough," he said. "Step away from the woman." The baby gasped. It was a small sound, barely audible over the ambient noise of the warehouse, but it was the most beautiful thing Adiz had ever heard. The infant's chest began to rise and fall on its own. Color returned to its skin. And then, finally, it began to cry. The hostages reacted with a collective exhalation of relief. Elena sobbed, reaching for her child. And in that moment of distraction, Adiz moved. She had been tracking Victor's position by sound throughout the resuscitation. She knew exactly where he stood, exactly how his weight was distributed, exactly how long it would take him to adjust his aim. She exploded from her kneeling position, driving her shoulder into his midsection before he could fire. The pistol discharged, the bullet sparking off the concrete floor, and then they were both on the ground, struggling for control of the weapon. Victor was strong, stronger than he looked, and he fought with the desperation of a man who knew he was dead if he lost. His free hand clawed at Adiz's face, seeking her eyes. His knee drove toward her ribs. But Adiz had been fighting her entire life. Fighting the river that took her sister. Fighting the current that tried to drown her. Fighting every superior who told her she did not belong. She trapped Victor's gun hand against the concrete and slammed her elbow into his throat. He gagged, his grip loosening. She tore the pistol from his fingers and drove the butt into his temple with enough force to end the struggle. Victor went limp beneath her. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Hostages were screaming, shouting questions, scrambling to their feet. The young man from the back wall rushed forward, grabbing Victor's unconscious body and looking to Adiz for direction. "The militants," he said. "They heard the gunshot. They are coming." Adiz was already moving. She crossed to the door she had broken through and listened. Voices outside, growing closer. Flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. At least a dozen of them, converging on the warehouse from multiple directions. She looked back at the hostages. 11 civilians, 1 newborn, 1 unconscious traitor. No vehicles, no backup, no clear path to safety. Except one. "The river," Adiz said. "We go out through the river. Everyone who can walk, help those who cannot. We move now." The hostages stared at her like she was insane. The river was death. The river was what everyone had been trying to escape. But Adiz had already survived it once. And right now, it was the only thing that might save them all. Adiz grabbed Victor's unconscious body and dragged him toward the rear of the warehouse. The traitor was coming with them. He had answers that command needed, names and connections that could unravel whatever network had put him here. "Everyone move," she commanded. "Stay low, stay quiet, follow me." The hostages responded with the desperate energy of people who finally saw a chance at survival. The young man who had helped restrain Victor took position beside Elena, supporting the new mother as she clutched her crying infant to her chest. 2 of the contractors lifted an older man who could barely walk. The remaining hostages formed a rough cluster, fear and hope warring on their faces. Adiz led them through the broken door and into the night. The compound had erupted into chaos. Floodlights swept across the muddy ground. Voices shouted in multiple languages. Somewhere to the east, an engine roared to life. The river was 50 meters away. It might as well have been 50 miles. She pushed Victor's body toward one of the stronger contractors. "Carry him. Do not let go no matter what happens." Then she turned and raised her rifle as the first militants appeared around the corner of the warehouse. She fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. 2 militants dropped. The third dove for cover. "Go," Adiz shouted. "Get to the water." The hostages ran. They stumbled through mud that sucked at their feet, tripped over debris they could not see, but they kept moving toward the dark ribbon of the river ahead. Adiz walked backward, rifle up, covering their retreat. Muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions as the militants realized what was happening. Bullets snapped through the air around her, close enough that she could feel the displaced wind. She returned fire in controlled bursts. One target down, another. Her magazine ran dry, and she slammed in a fresh one without breaking stride. The river bank appeared as a dark line in the darkness. The hostages reached it and stopped, staring at the churning water with terror. "I cannot swim," one of the contractors said. His voice cracked with panic. "None of us can swim in that." Adiz reached the bank and made an instant assessment. The current was still brutal, but it had slowed slightly since her earlier crossing. The debris had thinned. It was survivable, but only if they worked together. "Human chain," she ordered. "Link arms. The strongest swimmers on the outside, everyone else in the middle. We move together or we die apart." The hostages hesitated for a fraction of a second, then began organizing themselves. The young man who had helped with Victor took position at one end of the chain. A woman contractor who had mentioned swimming competitively in college anchored the other. Elena was placed in the center, her baby wrapped in a waterproof bag fashioned from a piece of tarp. Adiz fired 3 more rounds at approaching militants, then pushed Victor's unconscious body toward the contractors. "Get him in the water. Do not let him drown until after he talks." She was down to her last magazine, 30 rounds between her and an enemy force of unknown size. The hostages entered the river in a ragged line. The current seized them immediately, pulling at the human chain with hungry force. Someone screamed. Someone else shouted encouragement. But the chain held, and they began moving downstream, away from the compound, away from death. Adiz provided covering fire until the last hostage was in the water. Her body screamed with exhaustion. The cold she had fought off at May's camp was returning, seeping back into muscles that had nothing left to give. But she kept firing, kept the militants suppressed, kept buying seconds for people who needed every one of them. Then she heard the helicopters. The sound cut through the gunfire like a blade through cloth. Rotors, multiple aircraft, coming in fast from the north. For one terrible moment, Adiz thought they were enemy reinforcements. Then the radio on Victor's belt crackled to life, and a voice she recognized filled the night air. "Okonkwo, this is Hargrove. If you can hear me, get your people to the extraction point 200 meters downstream. We are coming in hot." Hargrove, the man who had told her the mission was aborted. The man who had accused her of writing her father's legacy. He was here. Adiz grabbed the radio. "Copy, Tempest Lead. 11 hostages plus 1 prisoner in the water. I am providing rear cover." There was a pause. Then Hargrove's voice returned, and something in it had changed. Something that sounded almost like respect. "Understood, Sergeant. We have your position. Cavalry is 30 seconds out." The helicopters roared overhead, their door gunners opening up on the compound with devastating effect. Militants who had been advancing on the river scattered, dove for cover, or simply died where they stood. Adiz allowed herself 3 seconds of relief. Then she turned toward the river, ready to join the hostages in the water. Her rifle clicked empty. She dropped the useless magazine and reached for another before remembering there were no more. For magazines, 120 rounds. She had fired them all. Movement in the tree line. 3 militants had circled around the helicopter fire, approaching the river bank from an angle the aircraft could not cover. They saw Adiz at the same moment she saw them. She had an empty rifle and a knife. They had automatic weapons and clear lines of fire. The hostages were in the water behind her, vulnerable, unable to help. The helicopters were focused on the compound, unaware of the threat. Adiz dropped her rifle and drew her knife. If she was going to die, she would die fighting. The militants raised their weapons. The militants were 10 meters away when the jungle behind them exploded with gunfire. Adiz saw muzzle flashes erupt from 3 positions in the tree line. The militants jerked and twisted as rounds tore through them from behind. They dropped into the mud without firing a single shot. Then Captain Vance Hargrove emerged from the darkness, his rifle still smoking, flanked by Moose and Restrepo. Hargrove crossed the distance to Adiz in 5 quick strides. His eyes swept over her, taking in the empty rifle, the drawn knife, the exhaustion carved into every line of her face. "You look like hell, Okonkwo," he said. Adiz tried to respond, but her legs chose that moment to give out. Hargrove caught her before she hit the ground, his arms surprisingly gentle for a man who had spent weeks treating her like an unwanted burden. "I have her," he said into his radio. "Get those hostages out of the water." Medical teams standing by at extraction point. The next several minutes blurred together in Adiz's memory. She was aware of being half-carried, half-dragged toward the waiting helicopters. She heard the hostages being pulled from the river, heard Elena crying with relief as medics took her baby for examination. She heard Victor Soren being zip-tied and hauled aboard a separate aircraft for interrogation. But mostly she heard Hargrove's voice, steady and close, talking her through the extraction. "Stay with me, Okonkwo. You did not swim 3 miles through hell to pass out now. Stay with me." She stayed. The helicopter ride was a chaos of medical personnel and thermal blankets and 4 lines being started in veins that did not want to cooperate. Someone was talking about core temperature and fluid resuscitation and potential complications from prolonged cold water immersion. Adiz heard it all from a great distance, as if she were floating above her own body, watching someone else receive treatment. Then the helicopter landed, and she was being transferred to a stretcher, and the lights of forward operating base Tempest surrounded her like a promise of safety. The last thing she saw before consciousness faded was Lean, the young interpreter, standing at the edge of the landing zone with tears streaming down her face and Adiz's note clutched in her hands. She had waited. Despite everything, she had waited. Adiz smiled, and then the darkness took her. She drifted in and out of awareness over the following days. Fever dreams mixed with fragments of reality. Her father's voice calling to her across a river that went on forever. Kayamika's hand reaching up from the water. Hargrove's face appearing at odd intervals, watching her with an expression she could not read. When she finally woke fully, 3 days had passed. The medical tent was quiet. Late afternoon light filtered through the canvas walls, casting everything in shades of gold and amber. Adiz lay on a cot with heated blankets wrapped around her and in 4 drip feeding warmth into her veins. She was alive. The realization arrived slowly, seeping through the fog of medication and exhaustion. "Welcome back." Adiz turned her head. Hargrove sat in a folding chair beside her cot, looking almost as tired as she felt. His uniform was wrinkled, his jaw shadowed with stubble. He held something in his hands, turning it over and over with careful fingers. Her photograph, the waterlogged image of her and Kayamika, somehow recovered from her gear. "How long have you been sitting there?" Adiz asked. Her voice was rough, barely functional. "Long enough." Hargrove set the photograph on the edge of her cot, within her reach. "The hostages are safe. All 11, plus the baby. Medical says the infant will make a full recovery. Elena is already asking when she can thank you personally. And Victor Soren. Intelligence has him. He is talking, trying to cut a deal. We will have names by the end of the week." Adiz nodded slowly. Her body ached in ways she had not known were possible, but the mission was complete. The hostages were alive. The traitor was in custody. "Why did you come?" she asked. "You ordered the abort. You said the mission was impossible." Hargrove was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different than she had ever heard it. Softer, more human. "After you left, Restrepo came to me. Told me you had taken his medical kit. That you had a look in your eyes he had seen before in soldiers who were about to do something either heroic or suicidal." Hargrove shook his head. "I tried to tell myself it was not my problem. That you had made your choice and I had made mine. What changed?" I intercepted a radio transmission. Victor Soren talking to his handlers, confirming that the rescue mission had been canceled. Hargrove's jaw tightened. "I realized someone had been feeding information to the enemy. And I realized that you were walking into a trap alone because I was too stubborn to listen to you." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes meeting hers directly for the first time since she had joined his team. "I was wrong about you, Okonkwo. I told myself you were here because of your father's name, because someone won a legacy soldier for the optics. But that was not true. It was never true. Then why did you treat me like I did not belong? Because every time I looked at you, I saw him. Hargrove's voice cracked slightly. I was there when your father died. I was 10 feet away when the bullet took him. I have spent 7 years telling myself I should have moved faster, should have seen the shooter, should have done something different. And when you showed up on my team, looking at me with his eyes, I could not handle it. Adiz felt something shift in her chest. Not anger, not resentment, something closer to understanding. My father made his own choices, she said, just like I made mine. I know that now. Hargrove reached out and touched the waterlogged photograph. Your father was the bravest soldier I ever served with. And what you did out there, swimming 3 miles through hell to save people everyone else had given up on, that was him. That was exactly what he would have done. He stood slowly, his movements stiff with exhaustion. There is something else, he said. Something I need to tell you about the night your sister drowned. Adiz felt her heart stop. After you left the briefing, I made some calls. I know people in Nigeria, military contacts from joint operations. I asked them to look into what happened to Kayamika. Hargrove paused, choosing his words carefully. There is something you need to know, and I think it might finally give you peace. He sat back down, and Adiz listened as the truth she had carried for 22 years began to change. Hargrove spoke slowly, giving each word the weight it deserved. My contact in Nigeria found the hydrological records from that night. He said, the night your sister drowned, there was a dam failure upstream, something that was never reported because the local government wanted to avoid responsibility. The water that hit your village was not a normal monsoon surge. It was a flash flood traveling at speeds that would have challenged Olympic swimmers. Adiz stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. The current that took Kayamika was moving at nearly 15 knots. Hargrove continued. 15 knots, Okonkwo. You were 12 years old, swimming against a force of nature that no child could have survived. The fact that you made it out of that water at all was a miracle. But I almost reached her, Adiz whispered. I was so close. Close does not mean possible. Hargrove leaned forward, his eyes holding hers. I spoke to hydrologists. I spoke to rescue swimmers who have worked flood conditions their entire careers. Every single one of them said the same thing. What you tried to do was physically impossible. You did not fail your sister. The river took her, and there was nothing on earth that could have stopped it. Adiz felt something break inside her chest. Not the sharp crack of fresh grief, but the slow crumbling of a wall she had built 22 years ago. A wall made of guilt and shame and the unshakable belief that she should have been better, faster, stronger. She had carried Kayamika's death like a stone around her neck for her entire adult life. Every achievement, every record, every impossible feat of endurance had been an attempt to become the person who could have saved her sister. But that person did not exist. Could not exist. The river had been too strong for anyone. It was not your fault, Hargrove said. It was never your fault. You were a child who tried to do something heroic and survived when you should have died. That is not failure. That is exactly who you still are. Adiz closed her eyes and let the tears come. She had not cried for Kayamika in years, had locked that grief away where it could fuel her without breaking her. But now, finally, she let herself feel the full weight of loss without the crushing burden of responsibility. Her sister was gone. That would never change. But the guilt that had driven her for 2 decades was a lie, and she could finally let it go. When she opened her eyes, Hargrove was standing. Get some rest, he said. The debrief can wait. And Okonkwo, one more thing. She looked up at him. I am recommending you for the Silver Star. What you did out there, the swim, the infiltration, the rescue, that was the finest display of individual courage I have witnessed in 18 years of service. Your father would have been proud. He left before she could respond. The days that followed passed in a blur of recovery and recognition. Adiz's hypothermia resolved without permanent damage. The cuts and bruises she had accumulated during the mission faded to minor inconveniences. By the end of the week, she was on her feet and moving through FOB Tempest like nothing had happened. But everything had happened, and everyone knew it. Moose found her in the mess hall on her 3rd day of mobility. The big communications specialist stood awkwardly at her table for a moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for the stray comment. For all of it. I was wrong about you, Okonkwo. We all were." Adiz studied him for a moment, then gestured to the empty seat across from her. "Sit down, Moose. Tell me about your family." The surprise on his face almost made her laugh. They talked for an hour, and by the end of it, Adiz understood that Moose's hostility had never been personal. He had lost his own sister to cancer 3 years ago and had been pushing away anyone who reminded him of what vulnerability felt like. They were not so different after all. Restrepo visited her quarters that evening, bringing the remains of his medical kit. "The baby is healthy," he said. "Elena named her Hope. She wants you to be the godmother." Adiz accepted the kit and the news with equal grace. She would visit Elena before leaving the base. She would hold the baby she had brought back from the edge of death. She would let herself feel the full weight of what she had accomplished. But first, there was someone else she needed to see. Lean was waiting outside the interpreter's quarters when Adiz arrived. The young woman jumped to her feet, her face cycling through relief and joy and something that looked like reverence. "You came back," Lean said. "Everyone said you would not, but I knew you would." Adiz smiled. "I made a promise to myself. I was not going to break it." They walked together along the perimeter of the base, and Adiz listened as Lean talked about her family, her dreams of studying medicine, the immigration obstacles that stood between her and a new life. By the time they circled back to the interpreter's quarters, Adiz had made a decision. "I have contacts in the States," she said. "Immigration lawyers who owe me favors. When this deployment ends, I'm going to make some calls. We're going to get you home, Lean. Whatever it takes." Lean stared at her with tears forming in her eyes. "Why? Why would you do this for me?" Adiz thought of Kayamika, of the sister she could not save and the guilt she had finally released. Lean was not a replacement for what she had lost, but she was a chance to honor that loss by helping someone who reminded her of everything good about the sister who had been taken too soon. "Because you deserve a future," Adiz said, "and because I can." On her last evening at FOB Tempest, Adiz walked to the river. The Mekara had calmed since the night of the rescue. The floodwaters had receded, and the current flowed with something approaching peace. Moonlight reflected off the surface, turning the water to silver. Adiz stood at the edge and looked downstream toward the compound she could no longer see. She had swum 3 miles through hell. She had killed to protect the innocent. She had saved 12 lives and exposed a traitor and earned the respect of men who had dismissed her. But more than any of that, she had finally made peace with the 12-year-old girl who had tried to save her sister and failed. "You would be proud of me," she said quietly to the river, to Kayamika, to her father, to everyone she had ever lost. "I finally understand." It was never about being strong enough to fight the current. It was about being brave enough to swim anyway. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the waterlogged photograph. Kayamika's face looked up at her, faded but still smiling, frozen forever in a moment of joy. Adiz did not throw the photograph into the river. She was done letting the water take things from her. Instead, she pressed it against her heart and made a new promise. She would live for both of them now. She would carry Kayamika's memory not as a wound, but as a blessing, a reminder of how precious life was and how fiercely it deserved to be protected. The river flowed on, indifferent and eternal. But Adiz Okonkwo was no longer afraid of its current. She had swum against it once, rifle held high, and she had won. If this story moved you, share your thoughts about what resonated most with you, or tell us about someone you know who faced impossible odds and refused to quit. Drop a comment and let us know.